Hey everyone, I'm professional photographer Ian Plant, and I see a lot of photos from photo enthusiasts like you. And too often I see a very common problem, and that's photos that look way overprocessed. Usually it's the result of the photographer doing an HDR blend, but it may also be when they're just processing a single image file, but the end result is always the same. The photographer has darkened the highlights and boosted the shadows too much, and the final photo doesn't quite look right. It just doesn't look natural to the point that it is jarring and uncanny to the viewer. Luckily, there is a solution to this, and all you need to do is follow one simple rule. I call it the Slinky Rule. I bet you all remember this toy from childhood, but if you've never seen a Slinky before, it really isn't that important. It's just here to help illustrate our discussion. When you're making a photograph, everything in the scene has a brightness or luminosity value. Some things are very bright and have a high luminosity value, while other things are very dark and have a low luminosity value. What those precise values are isn't the important thing. The important thing is where those values stand relative to each other. For example, with this photo of a coastal landscape scene at sunrise, the sky is the brightest part of the scene. The water is darker than the sky, and the shadowed landscape below is darker than the water, and so on. These relative luminosity values are important to keep in mind. During the editing process, you can alter the luminosity values of objects by making them lighter or darker. So, for example, you can darken that bright sky, or you can brighten the shadows, etc. But when you make the shadows as bright or brighter than the sky, things are going to start looking weird, and you'll end up with that unnatural, overprocessed look. The Slinky Rule tells you simply that it's okay to change the luminosity values of objects in your scene, but you should be careful and make sure that you preserve their relative luminosity positions. In other words, it's okay to darken the sky and it's okay to brighten the shadows, but in the end the sky should still be brighter than the shadowed landscape beneath it. Basically, you can make adjustments to any part of the photo, but be careful and avoid adjusting things to the point where you've mixed up the relative luminosity values. So, getting back to the Slinky, you can think of it as the histogram of your image file. You can stretch out the histogram and reveal more detail in midtone and shadow areas. Or you can go the other way and contract and squish the Slinky, and you do this by adding contrast, which reduces the dynamic range of the image file and will obscure detail in shadow and midtone areas. And you might want to do this, for example, if you're trying to enhance the silhouette effect for an image. But when you start mixing up the coils of the Slinky, when you jumble up the relative luminosity values of objects in your scene, that's when things start to get funky. And that is when the Slinky stops working. So if you want to avoid this mess, then you want to make sure you keep everything in its proper lane. For example, I took this photo of sunset on Lake Superior from inside a sandstone cave along the shore. I did an HDR exposure blend to capture the entire range from light to dark, but I was careful when processing the blended file to ensure that everything stayed in its proper relative luminosity position. As you can see, if I boost the shadows to reveal the detail in the cave walls, then the image begins to look unnatural. So instead, I pull back on the shadows, boosting them just a little bit. That way, I reveal some of the detail of the cave interior, but not so much that the file looks unnatural. This ensures that the colorful sunset is the brightest part of the scene, and the darker cave walls help frame the sunset and focus viewer attention there. One temptation in particular that you want to resist is the urge to brighten the shadows too much, and this is by far the most common mistake that I see people make. And you want to avoid falling into this trap, not just because it can make your photos look unnatural, but also because you want to be careful about what detail you reveal in your photo. Anything that is relatively bright in the composition will automatically draw the viewer's attention, so you want to be careful what you draw their attention to. You have to make an informed decision as to whether you want to reveal the detail in the shadows or obscure it. If the detail is important and attractive, then go ahead and boost the value of the shadows. Just don't overdo it. But if the detail is not important, or if it's not particularly attractive, or if by raising the value of the shadows it competes with other more important visual elements in your composition, then just say no. Don't do it. Leave the shadows dark, because if you don't, you'll end up diminishing the visual impact of your photos. Here's an example. While visiting the ancient rock-hewn churches of Ethiopia, I took this photo of a priest staring out of the open door of his church. There was no light inside the church, and the only light was coming from the outside. When processing the raw file, I first tried brightening the shadows, but I didn't like the detail that was revealed. It wasn't interesting, and I felt that it took away attention from my subject. So I zeroed out the shadows, and instead I activated the adjustment brush so I could make some targeted adjustments. I decided to increase exposure, shadows, clarity, and saturation, and applied these adjustments only to the priest and the colorful door behind him. Combined, these 4 adjustments helped bring out more detail. After applying the brush, I went back to the shadows and fine-tuned that effect. Then I zoomed in because I wanted to make a very precise, targeted adjustment to the gold cross that the priest was holding to give it more emphasis. Using the adjustment brush, I enhanced the color and exposure of the cross, making it a more important part of the composition. By letting the shadows stay dark, I was able to create a more graphic presentation, and I was able to more effectively tell the story of my subject by keeping the viewer's attention on the most important parts of the scene. Of course, this isn't meant to be an ironclad commandment, and there may be times when, for artistic reasons, you want to tangle up the Slinky. But if you do so, I recommend being selective and subtle about it. So if I decide to brighten or darken something in my scene when processing the image file, I usually apply the change to only a small part of the image, and I don't push it to an extreme place. Rather, I might give something a subtle boost. That way, even though I've jumbled up the Slinky, I've done it in a way that isn't too obvious to the viewer, thus avoiding that whole unnatural and uncanny look. For example, with this photo of a silverback mountain gorilla in Uganda, the gorilla was actually a little bit darker than the surrounding foliage. So I made a local adjustment to just the gorilla, brightening him until he was even with the greenery, maybe just a tad brighter. I was careful to not overdo it so that it wouldn't be obvious that anything had been done at all. But overall, whether you're doing an HDR merge or adjusting a single image file, keep the Slinky rule in mind. It'll help you make photos that are much more natural looking, which ultimately are going to be more appealing to the viewer. Stay tuned for our next great photo adventure, and make sure to subscribe to Shutter Monkeys TV here on YouTube. I'm Ian Plant, and thanks for watching.